So you can start. So what's your name?
My name is Kevin Burke. I was born in January, the end of January, January 29th, 1956. So I was actually born in the 50s and do remember the 1960s, even though I was young. In my very first recollections, age-wise, was around 3 years old. So I remember the 60s as a child and then as a middle schooler.
Okay. And where'd you grow up?
I grew up in, I grew up in Danville, Illinois, a small town in central Illinois. Uh, was born outside of Danville in a very small little town, and had to go to the hospital in Danville to be born. Spent 1 year in another city, but basically from up to age 18 was spent in Danville, Illinois. That's where I spent the 60s and graduated from high school in 1974.
So we're going to be talking about rock music. So what can you tell me about that?
I grew up in a home. My father died in 1966. I was age 10, and he enjoyed music. So I grew up in a home that had, back then it sounds, I realize all this sounds like ancient history, prehistoric. There weren't any dinosaurs left or anything, but we had a nice stereo, and my father liked to listen to records. And even though he was older, he liked some of the pre-rock and roll stuff. He liked country music, of course, but even some of the earliest stuff. Now, not the Beatles or Rolling Stones or the stuff that I liked, but I was able to listen to things like jazz and more pop type stuff. So I was introduced to music early on. I liked what I heard. And so by the time I was in middle school, and see, this would have been, of course, the mid to late 60s. It was the British invasion, they called it, with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and all the British groups that came across, plus the indigenous rock and roll that had come up in the United States because of that. And the rock and roll actually was an outgrowth of rhythm and blues, which started in the southern United States. So I ended up really, really liking rhythm and blues. And then it turned into soul music. So I gravitated more towards Sly and the Family Stone, the Temptations, and Motown. And that was my basic preference. But then, all of us, when we went to parties and stuff, we were listening to all of the latest groups. And then see, as I got into the later, the late last years of the 60s, 67, 8, 9. Well, see, Woodstock happened in 69, and Woodstock was huge. I mean, we used to sit around and listen to the double albums of the Woodstock Festival. And so, Santana and, all of that was huge. And it became a very big part of our lives. We had, once again, there wasn't any dinosaurs, but there was 8-track tapes. And so, of course, we all had 8-track tape players in our cars. We listened to James Taylor and and all of this stuff. And I just really liked most all of the rock and roll music because it was so important to us, because it was a way for us to be different than our parents. Our parents were listening to altogether different music than we were listening to. And of course, they hated it. You know, we were all going to be corrupted by this music. And that just made it more appealing, of course.
Why do you think they hated it so much?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think they hated the rock music so much?
Because of the rock culture that was around it. It wasn't necessary, you know, they didn't understand the music. The lyrics didn't make sense to them. They described it as noise, because it wasn't what they were used to listening to. But they also were very much opposed to the message in rock music. Um, the anti-war movement, there was a lot of that in there, in the music and the lyrics. A lot of civil rights. The drug culture was all involved in the music itself. Um, and when they could understand the lyrics, they weren't real impressed with them. And they thought it would corrupt us, that, because us guys, we were all wanting our hair to grow long and all that, God, and then you get to be my age, your hair falls out. That's it ends up being pretty disappointing, I can tell you, because we all thought as soon as I'm old enough, I'm going to grow my hair as long as I want. And it was part of it was the whole rebellion and trying to be an individual. And your parents in the 60s wanted us to conform more to short haircuts, et cetera, et cetera. And but I was very fortunate. Even though my father died when I was 10, my mother was she was very innovative, and she decided she didn't want to argue about length of hair. She was much more interested in us not going to jail. She wanted us to behave. And so she made a deal with my twin brother and I. If we stayed out of trouble, made good choices, we could grow our hair. And so when Kim, my twin brother and I, we would go to church, and our mom would actually be criticized by other parents because she let her two sons look like girls, was what they said back then. Well, those are a couple of cute girls, and it was ridiculed because we wanted to be different. And 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 so of course in all of that was, we liked our music and liked the whole idea of being different than the adults.
So your mom, did she like the music, or was she?
No, our mother did not embrace the music. Now she didn't. She let us buy albums, and we could listen to whatever music we wanted to listen to. But she was far more traditional in her personal preference. Um, she was, uh, you know, she was 39 years old when my brother and I were born. So when we were 10, she was 49. And so she was in her early 50s by the end of the 60s. And so the age difference there, I mean, like your mother is willing to listen to some of your music now, and she gets some of it. Now she still remembers um, the stuff that was popular when she was your age, and she still kind of likes that. I mean, we can tease her about Vanilla Ice and and some of the clowns she listened to. Because see, I didn't like her music. Music of the '80s there was very little of what your mother growing up. I didn't like very much of that because I was still enjoying, I still wanted to listen to rhythm and blues and more Motown and stuff like that. And what happened was, and what the difference between the 60s and the 80s, you know, when your mother was born, um, was there were a lot more choices of music. Um, when in the 60s, it was basically jazz, rock and roll, country, and gospel. I mean, there wasn't the the huge difference in music because rock and roll continued to grow through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what was under the umbrella of rock and roll in the 60s, that umbrella grew immensely to have a lot of different types of music. So, in answer your question, no, my mom did not listen to my music. Didn't like it.
Why do you think that rock music was the main genre for like anti-war and civil rights?
It it was embraced. Rock and roll became the anthem of the unhappiness, the discontent. Um, it was a way for the feelings about the war to be expressed by the young people. Um, the, and this was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was not a big issue until very late in the 60s. Um, but it, it, it was a very big subject and, and a lot of conflict here in the United States over a short period of time. Um, I graduated in 1974, and the year I turned 18 was the first provisional, what they called provisional draft. When you turned 18, you were registered, and if your birth date was if your birth date was pulled in the lottery, you were drafted and had to go into the armed forces. Your choices were to go into the armed forces, go to college and maybe get a deferment, or leave the country and go to Canada. I mean, that was your choices. So a lot of the anti-war thing was just fear. Us guys that were 18, we were scared. We didn't want to go to Vietnam. The whole idea of going to the other side of the world and getting shot at did not appeal to my friends and I. And so the whole idea that we could be forced to go do that created the whole anti-war thing. And then the music helped us express that fear and desire to miss it. Now then, I remember when I turned 18, they had ended the draft the year before. So it was like this huge relief. It's like, whew, I'm going to get to pick what I want to do instead of being told what I'm going to do. So at that point, um, then it became a case of how long are we going to stay involved in the war and American lives be lost. And so then the anger and discontent, the music continued to be a way of expressing that.
Were there any like protests near where you grew up?
The town I grew up in, Danville, Illinois, was a small town, you know, less than 50,000 people. So there was, I mean, and we didn't have a college. There was no college. basically an overgrown farm community, fairly conservative. So we didn't have protests locally. We saw the protest, we saw them on television. And so we didn't actually participate in them. We kind of lived vicariously through them. And, you know, so we would we wore our hair long, and we wore our bell bottom jeans and wore our love beads and peace symbols, and, you know, and walked around acting cool and saying no more war. But we were pretty safe because there wasn't any big protests for us to attend. Um, we could go to a college town and do that, but that would have been too much work. We'd rather just sit around and complain about it. But the other part of the 60s was the civil rights, the conflict between African Americans and and those of us that were white was very vivid. I can remember lots of racial conflict, even in a small town in central Illinois. There was serious racial conflict, and I mean physical confrontation. There were racial fights in my middle school, and then later in high school. I mean, we would have big fight. There would be large disturbances at our football games, and, you know, when two towns would come together. The black and white issue was very, very tense at that time. Now then, once again, I was very fortunate. In high school, which I realize is not in the 60s, but it was just after 69, I was in high school, and I was the school mascot. So I got to be around all the all the athletic teams and everything. So I got along well and still have black friends from high school. And so it was kind of odd. There was all this racial tension, but inside of all that, there was a lot of really good friendships made between blacks and whites, and so it was really kind of a contrast. But then once again, the music was very much involved with the racial conflict as well.
Are there, like, what were some musicians that you listened to that, like, commented on those issues?
Say that again, please.
What were some musicians that you listened to that commented on the issues that were happening?
Well, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young they wrote songs that were outspoken about social issues. One of my favorite artists, Marvin Gaye, wrote, one of his popular songs, "What's Going On." There was kind of part of rock and roll. There was also kind of a folk element in that too. And Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, and those weren't really my favorites. But there was a lot of folk music, poetry that became kind of mainstream rock and roll. I remember. I haven't thought about it in years. I remember there was one song that the only lyrics were "No more war." That's all it was, just repeated over and over and over. So once again, it was a way for young people to express themselves. And the whole hippie the hippie culture, I look back now and I thought I was cool enough to be a hippie, but I wasn't. I, you know, I enjoyed, I was too lazy to be a hippie. I didn't want to work that hard at it. I wanted to enjoy some of the nice things in life, like air conditioned house and, regular showers and, that kind of stuff. The whole camping out and being next to nature, and there were bugs and all kinds of icky things. And I wasn't into all that. I was much more into looking cool and dressing like a hippie instead of actually being a hippie. But I mean, there were conservative kids. I had buddies that wore short hair, and you know, they hated the hippie movement and everything, and they felt like it was very unpatriotic, etc., to be a hippie and question the war and everything. Yeah, the thing I remember about the 60s most was a lot of conflict and argument. It seemed we argued about everything.
Is there a specific protest that sticks out in your head?
Well, certainly 1968 Democratic presidential convention, the Democrat Party convention in 1968 was in Chicago. So I would have been 12 years old. I would have seen, and it was being in Chicago, excuse me, Chicago is about 3 hours north of Danville. So it was in the state of Illinois. So it felt local. There was a lot, it was seen a lot on television, and there was a tremendous amount of rioting, conflict with the police. And I remember there was the Chicago 7, which was a loosely grouped of high profile war protesters. And they all showed up in Chicago and protested because they wanted to end the war. And they wanted the Democrat Party to pick a candidate and take a end the war position for the 68 election. And see, this is where I much more looked like a hippie than actually was a hippie. Because in 1968, I watched all the fighting and the protesting and the police whacking people with billy clubs and tear gas and property destruction and all that, and I saw that as wrong. Granted, I was only 12 years old, but I just felt like that's not what you do. I was raised to be law abiding and behave myself and all that. And I just thought, you guys are acting up. I certainly feel differently about it now. And if it hadn't have been for the protests and the public expressed desire to end the war, we might have stayed longer. So the protests worked. It just wasn't very pretty, and it wasn't a very clean, simple type protest. It was ugly. And see, then while they're protesting the war, then we turn around and have race riots. Sweetheart, you probably don't. I've never heard of the race riots in Watts, WATTS. It was in California, and they just went in and the anger and the frustration was at such a point that they just rioted, burnt buildings, tore up stuff, looted, and all that. And it made for a very contentious, very conflicted um, us versus them. We've just came 19 in 2020. We came through a very ugly presidential campaign, um, and you know how liberal your grandfather is. I mean, thank all things holy, we're where we are now, but it's still very, very conflicted and very controversial, and anger on both sides. And people want to talk about how bad it is. Yes, it's bad. It's not a great situation we're in. But I remember in 1968, communities literally being on fire, blocks, multiple square blocks of cities that were destroyed because of rioting over race relations and the war. So um, when they talk about a riot now, um, I tend to look at them as not really. Yes, they're riots. There's property damage. People are getting hurt. There's conflict between um, the police and the protesters, but it's not as bad as it was in the late 60s. It was far worse, in my opinion, then. I mean, there were literally towns and places in big cities you didn't go to. You just didn't do it. Even in Danville, Illinois, we're talking about a town that was less than 50,000, around 40,000. There, at night, there was a section of Danville that white people just did not go to because there would be a confrontation.
Um, so do you think seeing all that as a child shaped you into who you are now?
Did it contribute to where I am now? Well, certainly the rock and roll music does, because now I've got poor hearing. Um, because the whole thing back then was to go to concerts and see what was different back then. This is a little side. Now then, they put a microphone in front of a little bitty amplifier for a guitar, and it's all done digitally and all this and everything. Back then, the idea was to have speakers as big as a city bus. I mean, speakers on top of speakers, literally. It was nothing for the speakers on stage to be 10, 12, 15 feet high. These speakers were the size of refrigerators. So, of course, we would go stand in front of the speakers, because then that's when it was loud and that's when it was good. So you stand there and do the head bob, bang your head to the music in front of the speakers. And then, of course, you put your 8-track in your car. And there was only one volume back then. We just turned everything up as high as it would go. So you rode around your cars with your stereos absolutely screaming. So, yeah, lasting effect is now then high frequency hearing loss, and I get to wear hearing aids. But I do now sit, and on YouTube I can watch the old concerts and some of the groups that I grew up with. And it has become, it's become very much a part of who I was growing up. A single mom for a parent, um, you know, the conflict and all that. I remember all that, and it makes the friendships that we have from that time more precious. Um, I'm not a huge fan of Facebook, but I've got I probably got 2,500 friends on Facebook. I don't spend a lot of time on it, but I cherish the part of Facebook where I can see my high school friends, the people that we went to concerts with, went to ball games with, and the music in the 60s and the 70s and all that we were involved with. We can relive that. And when I have a high school reunion now, one of the themes is usually about being hippies. So see, it stayed with us. The whole love each other and make love, not war was a big phrase for us. That stayed with us. And so for me personally, that time helped make me who I am and who I continue to be. And as I continue to get older, the memories of that do nothing but get fonder. I you know, I miss the music. You know, now I'm going to sound like the old fart again, but I do miss the music of the 60s and 70s. If you go back and listen to it, it has a message. Um, it talks about the things that I remember being important when I was a kid. I mean, you know, and growing up. So it's very nostalgic for me, and that music has stayed with me. I really don't. I have a hard time having 3 daughters and 7 granddaughters as I do. The whole WAP thing is not something that I think is all that helpful compared to the music that I grew up with. Of course, I like my music better.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah.
Um,
You know, I can't really picture, you know, when, you know, you're going to graduate next year, which will be 2022, right?
Mhm.
That'll be the year you graduate. So in 2062, think about that, 2062, at your 40th high school reunion, think about that. I just had my 45th a little over a year ago. So I graduated in 1974. Do the math. Anyway, I didn't, you know, yeah. So think of this, 2062, you're at your 40th high school reunion. You and your buddies are all standing around dancing to WAP. Does that, you're going to be, okay, now remember, your 40th high school reunion, you will be 58 years old at your 40th high school reunion. At my reunions, we still dance and sing the songs that we liked back then. I challenge you to do that at your 40th high school reunion.
I don't want to see that. I really don't.
Is your granddad being creepy now?
No, I do not want to see my school dancing like that. And
Okay.
um, do you think seeing all that through a child's eyes really scared you for your future?
I'm sorry. Say again.
Do you think seeing all that as a child really scared you for the future?
As a child, what?
Like seeing all the protests and violence scared you a little bit?
Did I sing them?
No, did it scare you?
Oh, seeing all the protests? I never really, I'm sorry, I just couldn't understand the question.
Okay.
So if I understand the question correctly is, did seeing all the protests and the upheaval, did that scare me?
Mhm.
Correct? No, because once again, it wasn't real local. I didn't live in a big city where the major protests and the rioting and all that took place. And I was not a young adult yet. I was So I wasn't scared about the future either. Where, like your age, I mean, you know, you're looking at getting out of high school next year, and you know, what's it going to be like when you get ready to get out of high school? Are we going to be? Are we still going to be fussing and angry with each other about stupid stuff? Are we still going to be arguing about assault rifles being legal? Are we still going to be concerned about somebody walking into the movie theater and shooting the place up? I never had that kind of fear. I mean, I remember my brother and I, at 10 years old, we would we would go to the movies on Saturday because our mother was working in the family business, of course. She would give us $1 a piece and we would go have lunch and go to the movies for the afternoon by ourselves downtown at 10 years old. There was no fear of somebody showing up in a movie theater and shooting it up. There was no fear of us being apprehended. I mean, I don't even want you to go. You're 17. I don't even want you to go to a movie by yourself. So, no, and answer your question, I didn't have that kind of fear. Um, it was much more of an adolescent fear of failure, fear of being embarrassed, you know, fear of farting in front of your girlfriend. I mean, that was the kind of fear I had as when I was at that age. I didn't have near the pressure or the fear or the concern or the anxiety or the pressures, all the stuff that your generation has. It breaks my heart to see what you have to deal with on a daily basis. It literally breaks my heart. It makes what I went through with all the rioting and all of the conflict and the war and all, it makes what I went through look like it was a trip to Disneyland compared to what you guys are having to put up with.
Think that's all my questions. Oh, one final one.
Yes.
What advice do you have as someone who lived through all the riots to go for us as a generation? If something similar were to happen, what would you say we should do?
Well, how I've changed is my opinion of okay, riots and protests have to be viewed as two different things. They're not the same thing. Riots come about when protests are ignored. What happened in the 60s, and see, for the civil rights thing, the civil rights protests started in the early 60s. And so you're talking about protests for 10 years with no relief. That's when the rioting happened. Rioting comes about when the protests have went on too long. The violence in the anti-war stuff was because the protests had went on long enough and weren't being listened to. I believe that as Americans, we have the right to protest the things that we feel are harmful to us. So I am not anti-peaceful protests. And far too often they call just insurrection and violent behavior, they call that protest. It's not. It's unlawful acts. My advice for your generation is don't let them call protesting rioting, number one. But it's important for you to build friendships and relationships you can count on. You don't have to have 500 friends, but you need friends, people that you don't have to agree with them all the time, but you need friends you can count on. I remember the most overwhelming emotion I felt going through the 60s was loneliness. This sounds very arrogant, but I was popular in school. I was well known in school. I went to a huge high school. You know, like I said, I thought I was really cool in high school and everything. But I felt lonely because I just never felt like I fit in with the group that I really wanted to fit in with. And it was because I looked more like a hippie than being a hippie. I didn't want to get involved with drugs. I didn't want to get involved with alcohol. I didn't want to get involved. I certainly didn't want for any of my girlfriends to get pregnant and me have to marry them. I mean, all of that. I wanted, it scared me. I wanted to stay away from all that. I could have really used, when I was your age, I could have really used good, close friends that I could count on. And so my advice for someone your age going through what we are right now is have a handful of people that you can count on. It doesn't mean you have to have slumber parties every weekend with them. I know you've outgrown slumber parties, but my point is, it's the person that you can say, hey, I'm having a bad day. How are you doing? And you can count on them. Because going through what you have to go through at your age by yourself, without someone to lean on, it gets pretty lonely.
I think that's it.